So let's actually talk about the next piece of this, which I think is really important, is there's all kinds of MVPs, and you heard me rattle out 5 or 6 ones from actually just talking about something and seeing if people will join your team, to actually using social media to see if people will use your platform, to very hacky versions, what it might be. Those are all different MVP concepts, but I think there's something important about figuring out what is the right concept for where your business stage is at. Because certainly interviews might be a great example, as well as down the road hiring a developer to build a first version. They're all different types of MVPs, but it's important to kind of match where you are to what you're actually doing. So I always think in the first part of this, of actually helping pick what MVP you should do, is you should start with a question. And for us, when we were building Zarly, the important question was, where is the biggest risk in this startup? What's the biggest, hardest point that we're worried about for this company? What could make this whole thing fall apart? And for us, the question that we always had is, if people asked for something, someone to mow their lawn, to paint their house, to bring them an iPad, would someone answer? That was our biggest question there. But the other things are, what are the biggest assumptions? The flip side of that is saying our biggest assumption was, if someone asked and said they would pay money for something, there was someone out there, if they were listening, that they would do it. So again, our biggest assumption. Or where in this experience could things break? The other question that we had when building Zarly was, how do we get people to ask? Where does that point break? So again, what you're thinking about is, when you're designing the experience, where do things break? And so I think the important steps, kind of there's 3 things that I like to talk through in actually picking what's the right MVP for you, is actually to start with 3 things. Number 1, describe the experience. Number 2, identify the risk points. So look throughout the entire experience. Where are the risk points in there? And then third, pick the riskiest. Start with the place that looks like it has the biggest chance of screwing up the entire endeavor, and start there. And it might be the part like, God, this is a really scary part right here, but that's the place you want to go. You want to go with the place where there's the biggest risk. So let me talk through what these mean. So the first step, describe the experience. Who here has ever done business process modeling at all? Or done business process? Okay. Can you tell, what is business process modeling?
Well, from the manufacturing perspective, you are starting at the beginning of the process, going and looking at inputs and outputs, both monetary and stuff, to the final product.
Yep. So that's a great example of one example of kind of the manufacturing sense, inputs and outputs. Anything that you do has a process to it. In particular, when you're doing a business, there's always some kind of a process to it. This is an example here of the way that a credit card gets processed as an example. There's actually a model that can be done of how does the process work. And so the first step in identifying any MVP is actually documenting what is the status quo. How does the process work that you're going to engage in? And that might be how you're going to change the process or how the current process is. But the first step is actually documenting that here. So who has a startup idea that they're working on? What's the startup idea? Describe it in a sentence.
We're looking at providing advisory services using foot traffic analytics in major metropolitan areas.
Okay, so foot traffic is kind of the, foot traffic analytics is a good way to do it. So I think part of the thing that you guys will first need to think about is, how do people currently think about foot traffic, or currently think about analytics of their business. So the important thing is documenting what's the current status quo. That might mean they go to their realtor and ask the realtor this question, or it might mean that they use some of the software, or turns out that the status quo might mean that they don't do anything. So ultimately what you're doing is documenting that first process, and really what you're trying to do is lay out the entire process soup to nuts. Now there's all kinds of free software out there. The best one I find is just put this in PowerPoint. Like literally create boxes and show the flows, step by step by step. The first step you might oftentimes do is actually just literally think through the process and describe it to someone else in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to end steps. Start there and then actually figure out what are the steps along the way. But you can't really understand where to start with MVP until you actually know the existing process. So the second thing in there is to look at the process and understand in that process that you're proposing. So you're likely taking a process and your product's going to sit somewhere in there. Where are the points that are the most challenging or have the biggest risk is what I said. In some ways you're looking for where are the places that things could break. So are you going to have trouble getting access to someone in that process? Will you have trouble distributing this to get to a big range of people? Maybe the pricing or the cost, or maybe there's just something big about you need a key partnership in there. But look through that kind of thing and break that process down into pieces. You're actually looking for the pieces in there where you're like, This makes me uncomfortable. Wherever you're most uncomfortable, that's where the awesomeness lies. So look for the places where you're uncomfortable. That is where awesomeness in startups lies. And I mean that in all seriousness. For us at Zarly, one of the things that we found is that people thought this was going to be really uncomfortable and really challenging. You're getting service providers to come in. The part that was the most scary is the reason if you get it right, you can win huge. So look for those places that are really there. And you try to get a list of the risks and the pinch points. And as you think through them, ask yourself, like, where do I feel uncomfortable about this whole thing? Or if you have trouble identifying that, ask someone who's totally unfamiliar with the business that you're in, and ask them where they think the biggest risks are. So then the third thing is pick the riskiest. And ultimately you're going to ask yourself a question. Can we sell this? Can we distribute this? Can we deliver this? Can we get data for it? Whatever you're trying to do, there's going to be a place in there where you're going to be challenged. And that's the place where your MVP is going to live, is you're ultimately looking for the place that makes you uncomfortable, that feels risky. And I know it seems weird. Why would you go to the place that's the toughest, the most challenging point? Because ultimately if you can figure out that, everything else is golden right there. So go to the place where it seems the hardest, and ultimately you're not building anything yet, you're just identifying that point. So one of the places that's a great way to find where those points in a business are is to actually use the business model canvas. So we talked about this in a couple of the prior lectures. The business model canvas essentially is a tool that helps you develop a series of hypotheses about key elements of your business. So what is the value proposition that you intend to deliver? Who is your target customer? What are the channels that you're going to access them through? Who are the partnerships? What are the key activities? All of these are a question. We believe that we're going to distribute this online. We believe that we're going to need to set up retail storefronts to service our customers. Or we believe that we're going to deliver awesomeness online. That's our value proposition. Whatever those are all a question. So oftentimes you can actually look right in the business model canvas and understand these hypotheses, these collections of assumptions, figure out which are the ones that you want to test. And I bucket them into two chunks. The first one is the value proposition and the target market. Those are the ones that I call to be the place where you're actually looking for product market fit. So you're oftentimes going to start in those two places. So if you aren't really sure if the dog's going to eat the dog food or if people are going to, people really want what you're going to build for them, ultimately start there and build your tests around there. If not, you can move on to the rest of the canvas, things like how you distribute it, how you price it, how you actually do partnerships. But always, unless you have a really good handle on will the dog eat the dog food, to use that broken analogy, start there. We're looking at the value proposition of your target customer. So the next part of this is actually what test should you run to test your MVP. And so we're going to go through all of these, but you can see there is a boatload of different ways you could test something. And it's part of the reason that I taught this class, or I'm teaching this class, is that I believe the biggest, hardest part is that everyone says, like, yeah, build an MVP, just go out and build an MVP, build an MVP. And if you're a first-time entrepreneur, an early entrepreneur, you're kind of like, I don't know what that means. And it's something that I've struggled with too, is like, I get it, I'm supposed to build an MVP, but I don't exactly know how. So the idea here is that we're going to take all of these MVPs and start to actually talk through them. And again, at the end, we're going to spend some time and help a couple people actually walk through their business and what the MVPs will be. The ways that I actually like to organize MVPs came from a guy named Stefan Rook. And I think that he actually came up with an interesting way of looking at it on a 2x2 axis, I guess, or an axis approach, which any of you MBAs will love the fact that we've got a grid format here. But the two pieces of the two axes here are coverage and product fidelity. So essentially what those mean, or coverage, is how many customers are you reaching in this MVP? Are you reaching just a few by doing interviews, or is it something you can reach tons and tons and tons by doing something online through AdWords? That's the concept of coverage. So how much access can you get there? And it's important. At the early days of building a company, as you'll see, you don't need to talk to that many people. You need to talk to a dozen or so interviewees. So the coverage doesn't have to be that big. But as you go on and you're figuring out how to start to ramp this thing up, you want much greater coverage, and it'll change the type of MVP you do. The second one is actually product fidelity. And this is a concept to see how much is the MVP actually like the end product you want to build. So again, an interview is not at all like the product you want to build, other than the fact you're talking about the product that you want to build. But it's not necessarily going to be representative of what the product is. And if you kind of go up that chain, you'll see things like building wireframes, or starting to actually build mock-ups goes up the chain until finally building the final product. So this is actually a framework that I like, which is how you actually organize these MVPs on these axes here. And you'll see, up in the top right up there is actually the final product, the product. And what you can see, the size of the actual dot that Stefan lays out is actually the amount of time and involvement it's going to take to get there. So you can see that there's actually things in the bottom, again, which I said, interviews and kind of AdWords. They don't have high product fidelity, but you can see you can start on one extreme, just kind of talking to customers in a low number, and ultimately do tests with AdWords and move up. As you go up there, you can see things like video and a software prototype all the way to the final product. We'll get more and more product fidelity to it. And we'll talk about something called the Concierge MVP and the Wizard of Oz MVP, which are two of my favorites that we'll talk about that, again, have a lower set of coverage, but they do have higher product fidelity. So does that make sense in a little bit of a framing exercise? Now we're going to talk through this in more detail, but again, I just want you to see these are kind of the broad way that I like to think about MVPs, and they fit at different stages of your business. All right, so here's part of my opinion on how you pick your strategy in it. And again, MVPs are not a one-shot deal. It's a process that you're going to go through. So I always like to say that early on, you're looking for things that have low coverage and low fidelity. So that's why I recommend everyone start with interviews. Again, it's not very many people, but it's ultimately a few, really good, tight interviews that you can learn a lot. And the next stage, after you get out of that interviewing stage, you're actually going to, and you see someone, I call it the head nodding stage. When you do these interviews and people are like, yeah, there might be something there. You're actually going to take one variable and go up at it. You're either going to try and build something or show some things that have a high fidelity of the product. So again, it might be that you build mock-ups or wireframes, or even to build one of these MVPs that's the kind of the concierge, which is not really much technology, a lot of hustle on your part, or something that is a front-end pretty face, but all the back behind is 25 Filipinos making the market for you. That's ultimately examples of kind of high fidelity but low coverage MVPs. On the other extreme, you're going to see things like you might actually go out and do, the other approach could be, let's actually test to see, does this value proposition, or can I get people to click on ads and large numbers and see the cost there? So again, those are the other approach. Once you've kind of gone up one of these areas here, so again, I recommend you either go along the bottom axes or you go along the left axis of product fidelity. You go up one of those ones, and you're ultimately going to be seeing, is there some more learnings along the way? Once you get to a point, you're going to then start to go the next direction. So you flip it. You're ultimately going to say, like, I've gone up one side. It turns out with this kind of concierge approach or mock-ups, people really like it. The next approach is say, maybe let's do a landing page and run some AdWords at it, because you're going to test the other one. Ultimately, what you're going to be generally trying to get is up and to the right. You're ultimately trying to get up in the point where you're going to build a software prototype and eventually software. So that's my philosophy on it. Not everyone does it that way, but again, I recommend starting out, once you've got kind of the early on interviews and you see people head nodding, pick one of the variables and go up. Don't try to do it all. There's no sense in actually starting to put out a big software prototyping or building a full product yet. You're just trying to basically learn more and more. And again, I recommend go up one flank and then go up the other flank, because you'll ultimately have enough learning that'll help kind of color along the way. So that's kind of my examples of how you approach MVPs a little bit.
What's your thoughts on bringing in partnerships for building MVPs, manufacturing partnerships to help out MVP development?
I think it all depends in terms of what stage you're at. So I would say, again, if I'm looking at this chart here, essentially you're saving those for the upper right edge, I guess, of the chart there. The more that you can basically, as the founder, do all of the things on the two axes to learn, the better. And so this is why I don't recommend that you outsource to a survey company, or you don't hire a college kid to go out and do interviews. You do all of the things on those pieces there because you just need to learn. So I would say, as you get up the curve, where you now have learnings around the fidelity access and the coverage access, again, you know you can get to enough customers at a relatively good price, and you know that people that you talk to at a bespoke level, a one-on-one level, or small group level actually like what you're building, then you can start to bring in partners. Other questions?
Would you say you're learning different types of things on the two axes?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a good judgment there. In some ways, really, if you look at the coverage ratio, one of the things you're trying to look at is, can you wind up delivering this at some type of volume and at some type of scale? There's a lot of things that you're actually trying to test, and a good example, we'll talk about landing pages. Landing pages are a great way to see if the internet, this vast wave of people actually like what you're doing or are interested in what you're doing. So it's a kind of a learning about customers in some senses at a general level. Do they think this is interesting and will they buy? As you're going up the other extreme, you're starting to learn a little bit more about actually the product you want to build and will people use it, will they like it, and that type of stuff. So again, if to build a successful, highly scalable product, you have to build both. Can we wind up delivering this to lots and lots of people and figure out how to do it? And the other extreme, can we wind up delivering a product that people actually will use and like?